You tune into the Four Boxes Diner to make connections that other people do not make and to be the smartest person in the room. I'm going to do exactly that for you in this video. I'm going to connect up how the proliferation and desire of civilian firearms ownership in the Ukraine is connected, yes indeed, to how the British lost their right to bear arms in the 20th century. And to understand this connection and this critically important historical lesson and how it's playing out in Europe today, so that you and I here in the United States never make these mistakes and lose our right to keep and bear arms. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this historical and modern lesson. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say a top 5 finalist in 2 separate 2024 Gundy Award categories, top male influencer in the Second Amendment space, and top voices of the Second Amendment. Let's see how things go in Las Vegas in a few weeks. All right, folks, so here's the story. So there's an article here in Reason Magazine. Reason Magazine, I like them quite a bit, long-standing free market libertarians, talking about the war with Russia teaches Ukraine and Ukrainians to value private guns. Now, you know I'm quite familiar with this, having written kind of like the definitive book on the topic, which of course is Disarmed, what the Ukraine war teaches Americans about the right to bear arms, so I'm quite familiar with what's going on in the Ukraine. But here's what's interesting. This article by Reason Magazine, which is very good, I'll put a link to it down below, this is what it says. Nothing enhances your appreciation for firearms like needing one to defend your family and yourself. That is certainly the experience of Ukrainians, say researchers. Many residents of the war-torn country, men in particular, who traditionally carry the burden of fighting in military service, recently told interviewers that they either own firearms or want to acquire them. Well, that's powerful language. It makes a lot of sense, meaning, the Ukrainians have learned the importance of civilian firearms ownership because they realized as soon as the Russians were going to invade and did invade, they started handing out tens of thousands of M16 and AK-47 type weapons to civilians and trying to build up a gun culture way too late, of course. They should have done this much earlier. But this point of the video is not about the Ukraine per se. It's about what's interesting about this survey and a mistake the Ukrainians are about to make again, and specifically what their government is about to do, and why this connects up to how we in the United States have to be extremely careful about sneakiness as to how governments take away the right to keep and bear arms. The Reason Magazine article is talking about a small arms survey conducted that concluded, and this is the title of the article, from conflict to consequence, nearly half of Ukrainian men would like to own a firearm or already have one. This article, meaning the study, talks about how the Ukrainians are kind of learning that they need to have guns and how the number of people carrying weapons for self-defense and the number of people that have guns and intend to keep guns is much larger than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. But that's not what I want to talk about in this video. Specifically, buried in the study is a discussion of what the Ukrainian government intends to do with those firearms that have gotten into civilian hands and that the civilian marketplace wants to protect themselves, because obviously if your government is not capable of protecting yourself because they get invaded by the Russians, well, you may want to just be ready for self-defense because, again, whether you're in the United States or the Ukraine, you are your own first responder. We learned this lesson over and over and over again. But what's interesting about this survey or the study that was conducted in the Ukraine is they're already starting to talk about gun control restrictions to be reimposed on the Ukrainian people as soon as this conflict ends. So here is what this study is talking about. It says, post-war security, a slippery slope. In the aftermath of a conflict, societies are likely to experience a surge in criminal violence, which encompasses both interpersonal violence and organized criminal activities where former combatants and military leaders seek to turn the skills they learned in their former roles into ways of exercising economic or political power, often resorting to illegal and violent methods to do so. This vulnerability is exacerbated by the increased availability of military-grade weaponry that finds its way into civilian circulation as these weapons leak from the battlefield. So there you have it. You see they're flagging the issue. It's already being discussed in the context of the scholarly literature that when a war ends, you have a greater risk of weapons and people doing bad things. what's happening now is that there is a crackdown or an anticipated crackdown on Ukrainian gun ownership that's going to start happening after the war ends with the Russians. And then I'm going to tie this into what we need to know based on the British experience from the 20th century. You're going to see some similarities here. You need to understand this so that we can protect our rights here in the United States so this doesn't happen to us. Specifically, the same study that talks about Ukrainian gun ownership goes on to say, in late June 2023, the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Ukraine embarked on a significant initiative by instituting the Unified Arms Registry. This endeavor reflects the ministry's commitment to enhancing the monitoring of the relatively permissive wartime access to firearms through intensified digital registration procedures primarily aimed at documenting firearm acquisitions and ensuring effective control. Did you hear what I just said? Effective control over the full life cycle of civilian firearms. So there you have it. So what's happening in the Ukraine? And we're going to tie this into America in 1 second. You have this rise in gun ownership and interest in civilian gun ownership, especially among men, less so among women, although women that live with men with guns are happy that the men have guns. That's according to the survey. You can check it out yourself because I'm going to link to it down below. Now, here's the key. Many people ask me, how is it that the Second Amendment, right to other people to keep and bear arms, which derives from the English Declaration of Rights from right after the Glorious Revolution, enacted in 1689, how is it that British and England goes from a favorable gun culture in their country to what we have today in England, which is no one's allowed to have a gun, barely the cops have guns. If you're protecting the royal family, I'm sure you're allowed to have guns to protect the royal family, but other than that, no one can have guns in England. How did they get there? Well, I'm going to give you a quick history lesson. You see, up until 1870, you could carry a gun anywhere you wanted in England for any purpose with no license needed whatsoever. In 1870, the rules remained very permissive. You could still carry a gun anywhere you wanted in the United Kingdom, I should say in England, of course, in 1870, but you had to get a small, inexpensive license, which everyone got. It was like buying a postage stamp, and if you didn't get that license from the post office from the period of 1870 to 1920, then guess what happened? You got fined. You weren't put in prison. It was not a big deal, and everyone could get it. No discretion, no big deal. Now, here's the key lesson that makes you the smartest person in the room when it comes to the history of gun rights all across the globe, and why it ties into the fact that despite the fact that the Ukrainians realize now they need to protect themselves from all sorts of things, and why the government is already getting ready to crack down as soon as the Russian fight is over to take those guns back from the Ukrainian citizens. They're already starting the process. It's because the governments are always about protecting themselves first. We learned this in England. Again, from 1870 to 1920, anyone in England can carry guns with simply buying a cheap, inexpensive postage stamp. No big deal. And if you didn't do it, you didn't even go to prison. Now, what happens? What happens? World War I happens. Now, if someone can please explain to me what the Europeans were fighting about in World War I, I'd like you to explain it to me, because it's still unclear to me what the heck they were fighting about with all these various, wars and these people getting just machine gunned to death in those trench warfares and gassed to death. It seems to me insanity as to what was going on there. Entire towns of young men were literally wiped out in like an afternoon. It seemed like this is an absurd war. What they were doing over there, I'd like you to explain to me, because I still don't quite get it. With that said, of course, that war ends in November of 1918. And why does this matter to your Second Amendment rights? It matters hugely. Here's why. World War I ends November 11th, 1918. The Armistice Day, the Armistice Treaty, all of this is signed. And guess what happens? The government of Great Britain is getting ready to disarm the population. They're starting the process. Nobody knows about it except the government itself. Specifically, and I get this research out of Stephen Halbrook's excellent book, The Right to Bear Arms. I'll put a link to it down below. This is what Stephen Halbrook's historical research found. It turns out that there was a report issued just at the very end of World War I. The reason why this report was issued is because the British government was fearful that the veterans coming back from the European conflict with guns, with familiarity with firearms, and angry with their government for sending them to these slaughterhouses for no real reason and no real benefit as they saw it. The British government was very worried that these veterans are going to come back to England in a very angry, pissed off mood with guns, and they were going to maybe do something such as topple the government or do anything else that was going to knock the elites, the governmental elites of England, down a peg or worse. So what happened is they commissioned a report called the Blackwell Report. The title of the report was The Report of the Committee on the Control of Firearms of 1918 by Sir Ernle Blackwell of the Home Office as follows. In Great Britain, prior to the Pistols Act of 1903, any person could purchase or keep in his possession a gun, pistol, or other firearm, or any number of weapons without restriction. The Gun License Act of 1870 only makes it necessary for him to obtain an excise license before he can legally use or carry a gun outside the curtilage of his dwelling house. But the license can be obtained by a simple formality of buying one at the post office for the sum of 10 shillings. Period. So what happens? So you have World War I, and then this is what that report continues on to say. And remember, this report is issued 4 days after Armistice Day. It's almost as if the British government prepared this report in anticipation of cracking down on civilian gun ownership as soon as World War I ended, because they knew the British government, had possibly screwed up royally in getting embroiled in this World War I with mass slaughters, trench warfare, people being machine gunned down, and stupid leadership causing the massacre of their own citizens for, again, arguably not much gain. Obviously, we can debate about this, but again, I look forward to you guys explaining to me what World War I was all about, because it's not clear to me even to this day. Elsewhere in the Blackwell Report, it says that the Blackwell Report worried that large numbers of pistols and possibly other weapons will have come into the possession of private persons, notably discharged soldiers and their relatives, and that the number of men skilled in the use of firearms will have greatly increased. Stephen Handbook, by the way, writes to say that danger was expected from, quote, the savage or semi-civilized tribesmen in outlying parts of the British Empire whose main demand is for rifles and ammunition, and two, the anarchist or intellectual malcontent of the great cities whose weapons are the bomb and the automatic pistol. So what exactly was the outcome of this Blackwell report that came out coincidentally right at the end of World War I? What exactly did this do, and how did this help the British government gain control over civilian firearms? Well, it turns out that basically the law of 1920 that was enacted, called the Firearms Act of 1920, was exactly that. It was a massive attempt to basically make it very difficult to get firearms, to give tremendous discretion to the police, the Home Office, and the like as to who gets the guns and who doesn't get the guns. Stephen Handbook writes about this in his book, The Right to Bear Arms, and this is what he writes and found based on his scholarship. The result was enactment of the Firearms Act of 1920, which required a firearm certificate to purchase, possess, use, or carry a firearm, and gave discretion to the chief of police to decide if an applicant had good reason for requiring such a certificate. The act was prompted far more by fear of revolution than of crime. After a secret meeting of the cabinet during its drafting, a skeptical secretary recorded, quote, I felt I had been to Bedlam, read revolution and blood, and war at home and abroad. And of course, with the enactment of the Firearms Act of 1920 in England, that begins a rapid decline in the ability of civilians to be able to use firearms, so that even today, literally today, even if you're allowed to have a firearm for the purposes of hunting or just sports shooting, for example, skeet or trap, you are not allowed to, in England, use a gun for self-defense. People have been put in jail for using a firearm in self-defense. There was recently a case several years ago involving a farmer who shot two burglars who broke into his home in the middle of the night, and he shot them, and he, the farmer, was charged. That is how terrible the right to keep and bear arms in England has collapsed from the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights in 1689 to today, where no one is allowed to have a gun as a general matter unless it's essentially locked up on some country manor somewhere that you can only shoot into a field for skeet or trap or maybe hunting. So again, the point of this and why I'm going to make you the smartest person in the room is you can already see today that the Ukrainian government is seeing that there is a rise in gun ownership interest among its citizens. right? That's what's happening. So what does the Ukrainian government do? They're starting to create their own version of the Blackwell report that we saw in the early 20th century in England. So it's pretty clear that the Ukrainian government has learned nothing. They're either more worried about their citizens, who maybe they view as peasants or peons or serfs, but they're more worried about their citizens having arms than making sure their country is protected from future invasions and future attacks by criminal and other evil elements. By analogy, it's no different than, as I see it, in the early 20th century, the Blackwell report that gave rise to the Firearms Act of 1920 in Great Britain, which was essentially the first major gun control legislation that really started to clamp down on the ability of citizens to have guns. And why did the English government do that? They were fearful that their subjects, you can call them citizens, but they're never really citizens because remember, you still have a monarchy in England and the Commonwealth. So the citizens / subjects of England were viewed as the threat to the government. So again, this is a classic example of top-down government where the government is out for their own best interest and care less so about the health and well-being of the citizens. Now, they may have paid lip service to why this is good for the English citizen to be disarmed and why it was important to consolidate power over the guns in England after World War I. They may have given some lip service why this is good for the English citizen or subject, but the reality was this was all about protecting the government, which seems to me the same thing we're seeing in the Ukraine, where they're getting ready for a post-Russian conflict government where they're going to crack down on gun ownership again. So the lesson, I think, for Americans is this: we must always be careful of how when these anti-gun reports come out and then the government starts talking about some anti-gun issue, that we need to do something about guns to protect the safety of the society. What they're really talking about is protecting, of course, their vested interest in the government and some other agenda, because the only reason that I see why people would want Americans to be disarmed is if they intend to do something that Americans are not going to be happy about, and they want to make sure there's no resistance. As a consequence, guess what? They disarm you, making you a subject or a serf and not a citizen, and makes it a lot easier to bully and boss you around in some way that they may plan on doing down the road. Those intents, those goals, those desires of theirs, we may not know yet, but again, it's certainly a lot easier to boss around someone that cannot push back or is a possibility of pushing back even if they never intend to do so. So with that said, here we go, folks. We've connected up the Ukrainian government's acts with the British government's acts in the 1920s, and where we are today with American gun rights. I'm happy to say we're much further along than both the Ukraine and the British. So I'm optimistic we're going to be okay, but we must always be vigilant to make sure that government overreach doesn't take away our rights in any respect. And it's my job to continue to identify potential problems before they take place, because again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say. All right, folks, hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Please subscribe. It makes you resubscribe because sometimes you get knocked off the list, I've been told. Don't forget to follow me on X at Four Boxes Diner, and we will see you again soon at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.